All right, let's talk about Google versus Oracle. And I'm very curious what y'all think of this. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going to try to give you the timeline. And Denise, I'm sure you'll fix it if I screw it up. I interviewed James Gosling about 3 weeks ago, the guy who wrote Java. And Sun, which was the company he was working for that owned Java, made Java open. People could develop for Java. They even said you could, I guess, write your own Javas. Of course, at one point, Google came to them, or maybe it was Andy Rubin before. It probably was Andy Rubin before Android was sold to Google. It said, I want to put Android on, I want to make it a Java-based operating system. Can we license it? They talked. There was no license deal. But Andy decided he didn't need to do a license deal because it was an open platform. Created his own Java virtual machine called Dalvik. Google bought Android. Oracle bought Sun. And the interesting thing is, Gosling told me this. He said, we saw Google's code and we felt like it was a little slimy, that Google didn't just kind of do clean room development of Dalvik. It looked like some of our code was in their code. It felt like we saw bits and pieces of our stuff in their code. It probably wasn't clean room, but it wasn't to the point where we were going to sue them. Well, it's like, oh, that's slimy, but we weren't we were upset, but we didn't plan on doing anything about it. He says, but when the negotiations between Oracle and Sun began in earnest, and he was in the room talking about this, he said, I saw the Oracle lawyers' eyes light up. They knew they had something. And they knew there could be a big payday at the end of the line. Oracle ended up suing Google. He said, the thing I really disagree with is that they didn't sue them over stealing the code. He said, the lawyers apparently decided that wasn't a winnable case. They copyrighted the API and then went after them for stealing the API, which is really kind of antithetical to the way the whole computer industry works. I mean, because of APIs, everything can talk to everything. We wouldn't have the PC industry if you hadn't been able to copy the interface to IBM's BIOS so that you could make IBM-compatible computers. That just wouldn't have happened. So everything from then on really relies on this idea that APIs are free and open and can be duplicated. Oracle lost. Now, I'm not sure the timeline on this. They lost the case. The case was appealed, turned down, appealed, again turned down. Finally, Oracle appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided we're not going to hear the case.
Not just yet.
Tell me about that.
They tried to get the Supreme Court involved before the entire case had been resolved. It got sent back down for trial, which is what is going to start a retrial on a particular issue, the fair use question, which is going to, and a couple of other things are going to happen next week. So the Supreme Court just declined to get involved at an early juncture. It could still get involved later on. Once there's been a trial and we have a final determination from the trial court, I'm sure there will be another appeal, whoever wins or loses, because the stakes are so high on both sides here. And at that point, the Supreme Court could say, okay, we think this is an important issue and get involved. But it's up to them.
I'll tell you how high the stakes are. Oracle's suing for, I used to say for $9 billion. It's actually 9.3. And I realized when you talk about 0.3 at that level, it's $300 million. So we're not going to leave that part out. $9.3 billion. I think the trial has begun. There's testimony, so I think the trial has begun. In court this week, Jonathan Schwartz, the last CEO at Sun, testifying kind of really on Google's behalf, along with Eric Schmidt.
Right, I'm sorry, I'm a week off.
Yes, yeah, we started this week. Yeah, and it's in front of the judge, William Alsup, who we celebrated. So he was the judge before and ruled in Google's favor. And we celebrated him because we thought finally a judge who knows something about this. He was a math major, but he said he taught himself Java so that he could rule on this case. And I think he even said, last night I wrote a bubble sort or something. I can't remember the exact thing. But anyway, we thought, wow, this guy's good. And so it's back in front of him. Basically, the court said it back to him. And it's a jury trial now, which is a little nerve-wracking. There's a jury of 10 people. And apparently there was at one point one person potentially on the jury who knew about technology and was bumped off by Oracle. So there's so basically it's 10 normal people who don't know anything about the subject at hand. And I don't feel like, Steve, these are people who are capable of ruling on something like, do they even know what an API is?
Yeah, I think that's what that motherboard piece really focuses on.
Man.
This is such, like you just said about what the importance of what an API is and how it, we wouldn't be talking over Skype right now, right? So the fact that people who don't even clearly grasp what that is, and they bump the one person who does grasp what that is off the jury, that's dangerous almost. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how they're arguing. I haven't listened to any of the testimony or anything. Hopefully the lawyers are phrasing everything such that the jury can understand it and distill it down so they can understand the true importance of what this means for the computing industry in general. It's really worrying, actually. That motherboard article's scary.
But they're not talking about
the
API.
API. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
For purposes of this trial, they don't have to decide whether APIs are copyrightable or not. That's already been determined, and now they're determining whether Google has a defense.
Whether they violated the copyright.
Yeah, and
whether fair use applies.
The reading I did on the first few days of this, and not being there, this is by definition superficial. It sure sounded like Google played fast and loose in a lot of ways, and the internal emails that they kept pulling out were horrible.
Yeah.
But I do want to come back to this idea that the APIs can be copyrighted. That's catastrophic for technology.
You tweeted it could be the end of the. Let's see. Let me read the tweet. If the open web dies, Oracle will be one of its killers, thanks to the terrible, horrible API case. And you're quoting a very good article in Ars Technica. By Joe Mullen about this.
Yeah, it's the contempt I'm feeling for Oracle right now is pretty enormous.
Boy, all right, I don't want to. Larry Ellison is not my favorite person in the world. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. So I think I got this a little bit wrong. So the judge said that APIs should not be eligible for copyright. That was the right thing.
Right. Then there was an appeal.
The Oracle appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which said they are creative works and should be copyrighted. And that's when the Supreme Court said, "Well, we're not going to."
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're not touching that yet. We're going to let this run its course. And
so what could happen here then is that the jury could say, "Oh yeah, it's not fair use. $9.3 billion to Google." Would Google then try to appeal that ruling, or would they go back to the Supreme Court about this whole notion of whether you can copyright an API? Because I don't care about $9.3 billion for Google. That's one thing. I care about copywriting APIs. That seems like a very dangerous precedent.
Right. And once there's been a trial and we determine, the appellate court has already said, okay, we think APIs are copyrightable. You need to finish up your trial. Which you didn't do the first time trial court because you decided they weren't copyrightable.
He threw it out.
Yes. So you need to go back and have a trial on that issue and see if Google's fair use defense flies before a jury, and they'll go through applying the fair use analysis and see how Google fares there. And then once there's a final decision on that point, they can't go straight to the Supreme Court. They have to appeal to the Ninth Circuit. And let the Ninth Circuit has already spoken on that one substantive issue that is so important to you, Leo. So if they say the same thing again, at that point, Google can knock on the Supreme Court's door and try and involve them. But again, that's purely up to the Supreme Court. They don't have to take cases.
Wasn't it though it wasn't the Ninth Circuit though? Wasn't it
It was the D.C. Court of Appeals.
DC that loves everything that has intellectual property.
Yeah, it went to the Federal Circuit, according to Joe, because they hear all patent appeals, and and Google prevailed on the patent claims. Oracle did not appeal the patent claims, but because the patent claim was in there, it went to Federal Circuit. And actually, I think the Ninth Circuit is I would guess, a little more sophisticated and maybe perhaps more sympathetic to Google. Yes or no?
Yeah, you're probably right. I was thinking Ninth Circuit because they're back in trial in San Francisco, but you're absolutely right.
No, went to the Federal Circuit.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Ninth Circuit, I think, would probably they're much more tech savvy, partially because of their location. And so one would, but again, this is. What really scares me is this seems to be in the hands of people who have a fairly thin grasp of what it all means. And maybe I'm giving too much weight to Sarah Zhang's Motherboard article, because she quotes from some of the testimony, and it was kind of a little chilling. The headline is, "In Oracle versus Google, a nerd subculture is on trial," and her point, at least her analysis of this, is that the jury is trying to wrap its head around things like free software in the sense of open source, liberated software. And at one point, a part of the problem is that you've got Jonathan Schwartz, who's trying to explain what an API is by talking about hamburgers on breakfast menus in restaurants, which even the judge said, "I don't understand one word of." He says, "I don't know what the witness just said. The thing about breakfast menu makes no sense." Oh boy.
Right. Well, there are, I think, a couple of ways that Google could pull this out ultimately. I mean, right now it has to live with this determination that APIs and this particular API is copyrightable.
They can't dispute that. That's already been decided.
Yeah, that's been decided for purposes of this trial. But, ultimately, hopefully, they'll get to take another whack at that one.
So this is a fair use case?
Yeah, because they now have to argue that, okay, if it's subject to copyright, we get to use it anyway. I'm hoping that somewhere in here, and I, like Dan, am not there at trial, haven't read the briefs, et cetera, but I'm hoping that an implied license argument is being made as well, because they didn't have an express license anywhere, but maybe the way that the parties conducted themselves and what Google was led to believe, you can't just sort of take back making something open simply because there's been a change of management and lawyers with a gleam in their eye.
Right.
So hopefully they do have some latches and estoppel arguments. Those are ways of saying you waited too long and you led us to believe that, you let us down the primrose path and led us to build things in reliance on what we reasonably believed.
Do you think it's a case that
so those kinds of arguments
that the jury could handle this? That this is not a technical argument?
I think so. I mean,
that a reasonable non-technical human could have an opinion on this.
I think so. I mean, lawyers all the time in technology cases have to distill very complicated issues in a way that juries can understand. And, the copyrightability question, I think, is really, really hard. But with that off the table for purposes of this trial, then you're into the whole fair use analysis, which, while kind of a wild card, and it doesn't fit this case very well, we're used to fair use being applied in different contexts. It's really hard to think about an API as a creative work, and that's why the copyrightability question is so controversial to begin with.
Yeah.
But if the jury's just asked to, whether they misled Google and these latches and estoppel arguments should apply, or whether Google hit the 4 fair use factors, that should be something a jury can process.
The 4 factors are those little rules about what makes something fair use, having to do with transformative. What are they again? Transformative use?
The purpose of the use. Why did you use it?
Right.
The nature of the work. Is it a highly creative work that your use?
I think Android's pretty damn creative.
The amount used. How much of the copyrighted work did you use? Did you use a portion of it, or
all
the
of the API? 37 calls. How much did you use? How much did you use of the API? Because if you only use a little of the API, that's okay.
And the effect on the market for the work. So
that
if you
might be
created
one
something,
where Oracle would have something to say, right? Because if
Google creates its own version of an API, does that mean that Oracle's version? Well, yeah.
It undermines the value of Java. Well, I don't want to give the lawyers any arguments, but it undermines the value of Java if anybody can come along and say, well, I don't need Java, I'll just duplicate the API. I think you could say that undermines the value of Java. But your point's well taken that was the intent of Java. That's what Sun's intent was before Oracle came along.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always thought this was a fascinating issue when I first started practicing and looking at APIs, and in some instances people license them,
Right.
and in other instances they're open and they're widely known as open. And
well, it's kind of the nature of an API. You have to publish an API if you want people to use it, because if they don't know the API, then they don't know how to use your stuff. So the API is always, to some degree, open. There are hidden API calls. Microsoft always kept some to itself, secret, Microsoft API calls that only it could use. But, or at least that was the assertion that we always used to make.
Right.
How do you feel, Dan? Are you bullish on this, or are you worried?
I'm really worried. I think this could be, pretty disastrous for open technology in general. There's a lot of things that we use every day that completely rely on the interoperability of technology and the web, et cetera.
Right.
And if suddenly if you need permission at every step, that's not good.
Right. It stifles innovation.